His name is a byword for stubborn, unbreakable principle. Cato the Younger, a Roman politician from 2,000 years ago, is remembered not for the power he held, but for the power he refused. Yet the man history knows is wrapped in legend. How did a flesh and blood statesman become the ultimate symbol of Stoic defiance? By the end of this story, you will understand the precise moment a political defeat was transformed into a moral victory that echoes through the centuries. We will separate the real man from the myth, tracing his philosophy from the classroom to his final, deliberate choice. What does it truly mean to live by your principles when everything is on the line? But to understand his defiance, you must first understand the world that forged him. Cato was born in already cracking under its own weight. For centuries, a delicate balance had held. The Senate, a council of elder statesmen, guided the state. Elected officials, the consuls, held executive power for short terms. The idea was to prevent any one man from gaining too much control, to keep the republic, the public thing, from becoming a private possession. Yet by Cato's time, that system was buckling. The norms of respect, compromise, and shared purpose that had glued it together were crumbling. In their place arose a new kind of politics, driven not by debate in the Senate House, but by the loyalty of armies and the cheers of the Roman crowds. This was the age of the great generals, men like Pompey, who conquered vast territories in the east, and Julius Caesar, whose ambition was as sharp as his military genius. They commanded legions personally loyal to them, not just to the abstract idea of Rome, and with those legions came a terrifying new form of power. The old guard in the Senate watched this shift with growing dread. They saw these popular commanders as demagogues, men who bypassed tradition to appeal directly to the people and the soldiers, promising wealth and land. To them, this wasn't just politics as usual. It was an existential struggle for the soul of the Republic. Would Rome remain a state governed by laws and collective wisdom, or would it fall under the sword of a single, unchallenged ruler? This was the crucible, the white-hot political fire into which Cato stepped. It was an era of crisis that didn't just allow for rigid principle, it practically demanded it. When everything is fluid and every compromise feels like a surrender, the person who stands like a rock becomes a symbol. The chaos of the late Republic didn't create Cato's character, but it presented the perfect, violent stage for it to play out upon. In a time of shifting alliances and moral gray areas, he chose to see the world in stark black and white. Into this fractured world, Marcus Porcius Cato was born, carrying a name already heavy with expectation. His great-grandfather was the legendary Cato the Elder, a man famous for his severe, old-fashioned virtues and his relentless criticism of luxury. From his earliest days, young Cato was immersed in stories of this austere ancestor, a model of Roman simplicity in an age of growing extravagance. But while other aristocratic boys were being groomed for political success through rhetoric and networking, Cato's path took a decisive philosophical turn. He was placed under the tutelage of a Stoic teacher named Antipater of Tyre. This was not a casual side study in ethics. It was the foundation upon which his entire character would be built. Stoicism for Cato was not a hobby, it was an operating system for life. Under Antipater, he internalized doctrines that would become the steel framework of his soul. The first and most crucial was that virtue, moral excellence, is the only true good. Wealth, fame, political power, even physical health, these were merely preferred indifferents. They had no inherent value for a good life. A person could be perfectly happy, meaning perfectly virtuous, while in poverty or disgrace. Conversely, a person could be miserable and corrupt while bathing in riches and applause. This idea completely inverted the normal Roman aristocratic drive for status and glory. The second tenet was the supremacy of reason and duty over emotion. A Stoic sage does not suppress feelings, but rather does not allow them to cloud judgment or dictate action. Every decision must flow from a rational understanding of what is right, from one's duty to nature and to others. Passion, what the Stoics called a diseased attachment, was the enemy of clear thinking. For a young man entering the turbulent Roman political arena, this was training in emotional armor. The third was the concept of living in accordance with nature, which meant accepting the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. Fate will bring hardship and loss, the Stoics taught, and your job is not to rage against it, but to meet it with unwavering resolve. This prepared Cato not for a life of ease, but for a life of principled struggle. Contrast this with the standard education of a Roman noble. Other young men learned the art of persuasive speech to sway crowds, the importance of strategic alliances through marriage and friendship, and the cultivation of a public image. Their training was in flexibility, in the art of the possible. Cato's Stoic education was in rigidity, in the art of the right. Where others saw a complex political landscape requiring nuance and compromise, Cato learned to see a moral battlefield where every concession was a potential defeat for virtue. This philosophical foundation did not just influence him, it constructed him. It turned the familial legacy of sternness into a conscious, unshakable worldview. He wasn't just being stubborn like his ancestor, he was being logically consistent according to a profound and demanding philosophy. When he later stood alone in the Senate, a voice of unwavering opposition, he wasn't merely being difficult. In his mind, he was the only one in the room being rational, the only one properly distinguishing the good from the indifferent. His tutors had taught him to build an inner citadel, a fortress of the mind that no external force could breach. Little did Rome know it was about to spend decades trying to prove them wrong. Armed with this unyielding philosophy, Cato entered public life not as a politician seeking office, but as a philosopher enacting a creed. His early career was a series of deliberate public demonstrations, each designed to show Rome what Stoic virtue looked like in the flesh. He did not merely argue for principle, he performed it. Take his work as a treasury official, a role others used for personal gain. Cato treated the public coffers with a reverence others reserved for temples, auditing accounts with such scrupulous detail that he became a living nightmare for corrupt officials. This was not bureaucratic nitpicking, it was a moral statement. In a system where skimming funds was an open secret, his refusal to participate was a radical act. He was proving that virtue, the only true good, could not be compromised, even for the customary rewards of power. His most famous early demonstration came not in the forum, but at the theater. Rome's elite often funded lavish public games to win popularity, a blatant trade of spectacle for political favor. When a particularly extravagant show was put on, the entire Senate, following custom, rose to applaud the benefactor. Cato alone remained seated, a silent, stony island in a sea of obsequiousness. He then stood and walked out. This was no petty protest. In Stoic terms, he was rejecting a preferred, indifferent public acclaim to uphold the good, which was his integrity. He showed the crowd that their cheers had no power over a man who valued only what was right. The message was clear: his approval could not be bought, not even with the adoration of Rome. This austerity extended to his personal life, making his philosophy impossible to ignore. While senators paraded in fine linens, Cato often walked the streets barefoot, wearing only a simple tunic, even in cold weather. He drank the same cheap wine as common soldiers. When given a military command, he marched alongside his men, carrying his own pack. These were not stunts, but consistent applications of his belief that luxury and comfort were distractions, not rewards. He was dismantling, piece by piece, the very symbols of status that Roman politics was built upon. To his opponents, this was infuriating theatrics. To the poor and the disillusioned, it was a shocking spectacle of authenticity. Here was an aristocrat who lived by the harsh standards he demanded of the state. His relentless attacks on fiscal corruption made him countless enemies. He would prosecute powerful men for bribery and embezzlement with a fearlessness that seemed suicidal. He wasn't seeking to build a faction. He was purging what he saw as a sickness in the Republic's soul. Every case was a battle in a larger war, not for political dominance but for moral survival. These actions were deeply unpopular with the political class, who saw him as a rigid fanatic wrecking the subtle game of give and take. But Cato's goal was never popularity. It was consistency. Each prosecution, each walkout, each barefoot stroll was a brick in the public monument he was building to his own integrity. He was creating a character so steadfast, so predictable in his virtue, that his very presence in a room became a moral compass. People didn't just disagree with Cato, they felt judged by him. And in a society slipping into moral ambiguity, that judgment was a light too harsh for many to bear. He was becoming less a politician and more a living conscience for Rome, a role that would soon place him on a direct collision course with the Republic's most formidable and flexible mind. The stage was now set for a collision of titans, but this was not a simple clash of political rivals. It was a battle for the soul of Rome, personified in two men who could not have been more different. On one side stood Julius Caesar, a master of charm, calculation, and breathtaking ambition. He understood the new Rome, a place where the old rules were obstacles to be navigated, not commandments to be obeyed. He built his power on generosity, forging unbreakable bonds with his soldiers by sharing the spoils of war, and captivating the common people with grand public spectacles. His political philosophy was one of brilliant flexibility. He would form alliances with anyone, even his bitterest enemies, if it served his long-term goals. He saw the decaying republic not as a sacred temple to be preserved, but as a complex machine that could be taken apart and reassembled under new management. His currency was loyalty, his method was motion, and his goal was a greatness that had no room for limits. And then there was Cato. Where Caesar was fluid, Cato was granite. He did not build loyalty, he demanded principle. He saw Caesar's populist generosity not as kindness, but as bribery on a national scale, a corrosive force that traded the people's virtue for their temporary favor. While Caesar mastered the art of the possible, Cato spoke only of the right. Their enmity began early and burned intensely. One famous confrontation in the Senate crystallized their opposing worlds. Caesar, as a young official, was pushing for a land reform bill to provide for Pompey's veterans, a popular move with the army and the people. Cato saw it as a naked grab for power, using public funds to buy the permanent loyalty of a private army. He stood and began to speak, and he did not stop. He spoke through the entire day, using an old procedural trick, filibustering until the session had to end and the vote was delayed. It was a weaponization of sheer endurance, a physical manifestation of his stubborn will. But Caesar was not so easily thwarted. Furious, he ordered his guards to arrest Cato and drag him to prison, hoping to silence him. The other senators, shocked, began to follow Cato out in solidarity. Caesar, realizing he had overplayed his hand, was forced to relent and order his release. In that moment, you see the core conflict. Caesar believed in force and outcome. Cato believed in law and process, and was willing to become a martyr to that process to expose Caesar's tyranny. For Cato, every political maneuver by Caesar was not just a policy difference, it was a symptom of a moral disease. He publicly accused Caesar of corruption, of plotting to become a king, of embodying everything that would destroy the Republic. He opposed not just Caesar's actions but his very character. The Senate floor became their arena. Cato would denounce Caesar in speeches of blistering, uncompromising scorn. Caesar would respond with cool, ironic wit, trying to paint Cato as a fanatic out of touch with the realities of Rome. But Caesar's calm demeanor was a mask, for he feared Cato more than any army. He once confessed that Cato's stubborn virtue, his refusal to be flattered or bribed or threatened, was the most dangerous force in Roman politics. While other senators could be negotiated with, Cato could only be opposed. This was more than a rivalry, it was a philosophical war. Caesar represented a new world order built on personal authority and practical genius. Cato was the last, unyielding defender of an old world built on collective law and austere virtue. One man sought to build an empire, the other sought to save a republic that, in truth, may have already been lost. Their conflict would soon escalate from speeches and procedural delays to a struggle that would engulf the entire Mediterranean world. The philosophical war between rigidity and ambition finally found its battlefield. In the cold winter of the year 49 before the Common Era, Julius Caesar stood with a single legion on the northern bank of the Rubicon River. This small waterway marked the legal boundary of his military command. Roman law was explicit. A general could not lead troops south of the Rubicon into Italy proper. To do so was not a political protest, it was a declaration of war against the Roman state itself. Caesar paused, weighing the irreversible step. The die is cast, he is said to have declared, and then he ordered his men across. That simple movement of soldiers across a shallow river was the catalyst that shattered 5 centuries of republican tradition. It was the ultimate act of flexibility, a decisive break from all precedent, placing personal authority above constitutional law. The civil war that every senator had feared for decades had now begun. In Rome, the news was met with panic and a frantic exodus. Senators who had long opposed Caesar now fled for their lives. Among them was Cato, but his response carried a terrible clarity. There was no hesitation, no complex calculation of odds. For him, the Rubicon crossing was not just a military maneuver, it was the final, undeniable proof of everything he had warned against. Tyranny was no longer a rhetorical accusation, it was a marching army. His duty was now unmistakable. He joined the forces of Pompey, the Senate's appointed commander, but his allegiance was not to Pompey the man. Pompey was flawed, a former ally of Caesar, a political opportunist himself. Cato's loyalty was to the Senate and the people of Rome, the SPQR inscribed on every standard, the abstract ideal of the constitutional order itself. He was not fighting for a general, he was fighting for a principle, the idea that no man, no matter how brilliant or popular, was above the law. This choice reveals the core of his Stoic defiance. A purely practical man might have stayed in Rome, negotiated, or even switched sides to survive the coming storm. But Cato had spent a lifetime training for this exact moment, when duty would demand everything. The preferred indifference of safety, comfort, and even his own life were now irrelevant. The only good was to stand with the legitimate, besieged republic. He reportedly said that he would rather die defending the old laws than live under the new ones being imposed by force. His journey to join Pompey's camp was not a flight to safety, but a march toward what he saw as his necessary post. He was placing his body, his reputation, and his fate on the line for an idea that was already crumbling. In doing so, he transformed from a political obstruction into a living symbol of republican resistance. The man who had been a conscience in the Senate was now becoming a standard on the battlefield, a reminder of what precisely was being lost. The thunder of defeat at Pharsalus echoed across the Mediterranean. Pompey's army was shattered, and the senator himself fled, only to meet his end in Egypt. For the forces of the Republic, the cause seemed utterly lost. Yet for Cato, the crushing military loss did not alter the moral equation in the slightest. His duty remained. Gathering the scattered remnants of the senatorial forces, he made a deliberate, almost defiant choice. He would not sail to Egypt or seek some distant ally. Instead, he led his band to the North African city of Utica, a Roman province still holding out against Caesar. This was not a strategic retreat to safety, it was a conscious preparation for a final stand. In Utica, Cato transformed from a politician into the administrator of a doomed citadel. With the calm precision of a Stoic, he set about his work. He fortified the city's defenses, not with the frenzy of desperation, but with the methodical care of a man building something meant to last. He took inventory of every grain of wheat, every weapon, every coin in the treasury. He drilled the soldiers and coordinated with local leaders, all while managing the anxieties of the Roman civilians and senators who had followed him there, terrified of Caesar's retribution. What is remarkable is the tone of these final days. There are no recorded outbursts of rage or grief. Instead, we see a man applying reason to a hopeless situation. He held philosophical discussions in the evenings, debating the nature of good and evil with the same intensity as when he walked the halls of the Senate. He continued to live with his famous austerity, sharing the same rations as the lowest soldier. This was his ultimate demonstration. When everything external victory, power, even likely survival had been stripped away, what remained was character. His management of Utica was a daily lesson in that principle. He was showing everyone, from the frightened noble to the common legionary, how a person of virtue conducts themselves when the world has fallen apart. He was not waiting for a miracle or a pardon. He was meticulously building a stage upon which his final and most definitive act of defiance would be performed. The war was lost, but the philosophical conflict was reaching its climax. In Utica, Cato was proving that defeat could be managed with the same rational discipline as victory, and that true freedom lay not in controlling one's circumstances, but in controlling one's response to them. The news from Thapsus was a final, crushing verdict. Caesar's forces had annihilated the last major Republican army in Africa. There would be no relief for Utica, no last-minute reversal of fortune. For Cato, the external struggle was conclusively over, yet this moment of absolute political defeat became the moment for his most profound philosophical stand. In the quiet of his chamber, he turned his reason inward to the one freedom that remained utterly his own, the freedom to choose his exit. To understand this choice, we must step away from modern perspectives and into the Stoic framework that was his world. For a Stoic, life was not an absolute good to be clung to at any cost. The ultimate good was virtue, living in accordance with reason and nature. If circumstances arose that made a virtuous life impossible, if a person was trapped in a situation where they could only act against their principles, then a rational exit was not only permissible, it could be the most honorable act available. The famous Stoic teacher Epictetus would later use a powerful analogy. He said, "If the room is full of smoke, and the smoke is not too thick, you stay. But if it becomes so dense you cannot breathe or see, you leave." The room is life, the smoke is the conditions that prevent a life of virtue. Staying in an unbearable, virtue-crushing situation was not bravery, it was irrationality. For Cato, Caesar's impending victory was that suffocating smoke. To live under a dictator, to accept a pardon from a man he believed had destroyed the law, would be to participate in the tyranny. It would mean surrendering his inner citadel, the fortress of principle he had spent a lifetime building. His freedom to act with integrity, to serve the republic he loved, was being irrevocably removed by an external force. Therefore, the rational calculation, in his view, was clear. To choose his own end on his own terms was the final, definitive assertion of his freedom. It was not an act of despair, but of supreme agency. It was not a surrender to death, but a rejection of a life he deemed unlivable. This was the ultimate application of his creed, separating the preferred indifferent of biological life from the only true good, which was moral integrity. In that quiet room, preparing for his final act, Cato was not a defeated man. He was a philosopher executing the logical conclusion of his deepest beliefs, turning his very end into a statement so powerful it would echo for millennia. That final night in Utica was a masterclass in composed intention. With the city secured and the escape routes for his friends arranged, Cato did not spend his remaining hours in frantic worry or dramatic farewells. Instead, he retired to his chamber and performed the simple, profound rituals of an ordinary evening. He bathed, he dined with his companions, and then he asked for a book. The text he requested was Plato Phaedo, a dialogue that recounts the final hours of Socrates, another philosopher condemned by the state. In it, Socrates calmly discusses the nature of the soul, arguing for its immortality, before drinking the hemlock as his friends weep around him. Cato read this story not as a distraction but as a guide. Here was the blueprint for a philosophical departure, a model of how reason could master the deepest human fear. The quiet turning of pages in that lamplit room was itself a statement. It said that even at this threshold, the mind could still be engaged, curiosity could still be honored, and wisdom from centuries past could still provide companionship. He was not seeking escape in the pages, he was seeking confirmation. In Socrates' unwavering calm, he saw a reflection of his own Stoic resolve, proof that a person could meet their end not with blind terror but with thoughtful acceptance. When he finished reading, he placed the scroll aside and lay down to sleep. To rest peacefully on the eve of such a choice seems almost superhuman to us. But for Cato, it was the logical outcome of a lifetime of practice. Philosophy had not just prepared him for this moment, it had dissolved the crisis within it. The questions of what comes after, the natural anxiety about the unknown, had been examined and settled in his mind long before. The clarity he found in Plato's words was not a new discovery, but a final reinforcement of a truth he already lived by. His sleep was not an act of indifference but the ultimate sign of a soul at peace with its own reasoned decision. When the sword was brought to him the next day, it was not an interruption of his peace, but the instrument of its final expression. The morning light found him resolved, with his son safely away and his household reassured of his care for them. Cato dismissed his attendants and retired to his chamber one final time. He took up a short sword, a gladiator's blade. In the quiet of that room he made his choice. The act itself was swift, a deliberate strike, yet the body, even of a Stoic, is stubborn. The wound was severe, but it did not bring the immediate end he had intended. The sound of his fall brought his servants and his son rushing back into the room. Seeing him there, they cried out for physicians, desperate to save the man they loved. When the doctors arrived and began to tend to him, Cato, regaining a moment of consciousness, understood what was happening. To his philosophical mind, this intervention was not salvation, it was an invasion. It threatened to return him to a world where his principles would be held captive, to force him to accept a life of compromise under a tyrant's rule. With a surge of will that seems almost beyond human capacity, he rejected their aid. And then, in a final, terrible assertion of his own agency, he reached for his wound and tore open the stitches the physicians had just applied. This second, agonizing act was the ultimate seal of his defiance. It was not an act of despair, but one of fierce, rational intention. He was reclaiming the only freedom left to him, the freedom to choose his own terms. In that moment, the philosopher completed his final demonstration. He proved that even the most intimate bond, the instinct to preserve life itself, could be overruled by a commitment to principle that was deeper still. His passing was not a quiet slipping away, but a deliberate, wrenching departure that would sear his legacy into the memory of the ancient world. The power of his final act was not in the death itself, but in the precise, deliberate manner of its execution. In the brutal calculus of civil war, the passing of one more senator would have been a mere statistic. but Cato's composure, his methodical reading, and his calm preparation elevated it into something entirely different. It was a performance of reason in the face of chaos, a demonstration that his inner freedom remained untouched by external defeat. He did not rage or weep, he did not flee or beg. He simply, and with terrifying clarity, applied his philosophy to its logical conclusion. This composure was the first layer of the symbol, proving that Stoic virtue was not just for political debates, but for the ultimate human trial. It made his end not a tragic collapse, but a chosen destination, robbing his enemies of the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Crucially, his act was a direct, bodily rejection of Caesar's most potent weapon, clemency. In the wake of his victories, Caesar famously offered pardon to his former enemies, a policy he called clementia. But in the Roman world, this was not pure forgiveness. It was a form of domination, a public display of the victor's power to grant life itself. To accept Caesar's pardon was to acknowledge his absolute authority, to become a living monument to his mercy, and by extension, his right to rule. Cato's choice to end his own life was a shattering of that script. He denied Caesar the power to forgive him. In his final moments, he reclaimed his agency, declaring that his life was his own to give, not Caesar's to grant. This transformed a personal end into a devastating political critique. His death said, loudly and without words, that some principles were worth more than a life granted by a tyrant. The most harrowing detail, his final act of reopening the wound, cemented the symbol in raw, human terms. It was the ultimate assertion of will over instinct, of principle over the body's desperate drive to survive. This was not a quiet philosophical departure, but a fierce physical struggle to complete the statement he had begun. In that terrible moment, the abstract ideal of freedom became agonizingly concrete. He was proving, in the most visceral way possible, that his commitment to liberty was stronger than the very force of life within him. For the ancient world, this act transcended politics. It transformed Cato from a defeated politician into a martyr for liberties, for the Republican ideal of freedom from the dominion of any one man. His death was no longer just an end, it was a beginning, a story that would be told and retold, a standard for all who believed some lines must never be crossed, no matter the cost. Word of the event reached Caesar not as a battlefield report, but as a philosophical puzzle he could not solve. The conqueror of nations, the master of men, stood momentarily confounded by a single, deliberate absence. Upon hearing the news, Caesar is said to have uttered a line heavy with a strange, reluctant admiration. He said, "Cato, I begrudge you your death as you begrudged me the honor of saving your life." It is a statement that requires us to listen closely, for it reveals a crack in the victor's armor. On the surface, it is a lament about lost opportunity. Caesar's policy of clemency was a brilliant political tool designed to heal divisions and bind former enemies to him through a debt of gratitude. By taking his own life, Cato had violently refused this debt. He had stolen from Caesar the ultimate trophy, the chance to display his magnanimity by pardoning his most principled foe. In that sense, Cato had robbed the victor of a victory. But the deeper meaning cuts to the heart of their lifelong struggle. When Caesar says he begrudged Cato his death, he is admitting, perhaps for the first time, that Cato had achieved something he could not. Caesar had won every external contest, every battle, every political maneuver. He commanded legions and controlled the fate of millions. Yet Cato, in his final act, had demonstrated a sovereignty over himself that Caesar's power could never touch. Cato's inner citadel remained unconquered. In envying that death, Caesar was unconsciously acknowledging that his rival had secured a form of freedom and moral authority that all the power in Rome could not grant or take away. It was the ultimate checkmate in a game Caesar thought he had won. The man of limitless ambition found himself staring at the one limit he could not cross, the boundary of another's inviolable will. This reaction transforms the story from a simple tragedy into a profound irony. The greatest general of the age, the architect of a new world order, was forced to concede that his most stubborn opponent had, in the realm that mattered most to them both, written the final line of the story. Cato's defiance had created a legacy that not even Caesar's victory could erase. The body had scarcely grown cold before the legend began to breathe. Cato's allies, scattered and defeated, now possessed something more potent than an army. They had a story. And in the hands of men like Cicero and Marcus Brutus, that story was carefully, deliberately sculpted. They did not merely mourn a fallen friend, they began to construct a symbol. Cicero, the master orator, took up his pen. In a series of powerful writings, he framed Cato's final act not as a desperate escape, but as a conscious, heroic sacrifice for the ideal of libertas, for freedom from the rule of one man. He painted Cato as the embodiment of ancient Roman virtue, a man who chose death over the site of a corrupted republic. This was not simple eulogy, it was political alchemy, transforming a tragic personal end into a public standard. Meanwhile, Brutus, Cato's own nephew and a man deeply influenced by his Stoic rigor, carried that standard like a physical weight. He reportedly kept a small bust of Cato with him at all times, a constant reminder of the principle his uncle had died for. For Brutus and his fellow conspirators, Cato's ghost became the silent third member of their plots. When they moved against Caesar on the Ides of March, they were not just assassinating a dictator, they believed they were executing Cato's posthumous judgment. In this way, Cato's death provided the moral fuel for the very act meant to avenge it. He had become the archetype of the Stoic martyr. This was a new and powerful concept in the Roman world. A martyr does not just die for a cause, they weaponize their own passing, turning it into an indelible argument that outlives them. Cato's composed, reasoned departure offered a perfect template. It showed that resistance could be philosophical, personal, and absolute, even when military and political power had failed. His story gave a scattered opposition a shared identity and a towering example of resolve. Long after Caesar's assassins were themselves defeated, Cato's legend endured. A flickering torch passed through the deepening shadow of imperial rule. For every senator who chafed under the quiet domination of an emperor, for every philosopher who prized inner freedom above external favor, the man from Utica stood as proof that the soul could remain unconquered. His defiance had created a language of resistance that required no legions, only an unbreakable will. But a legend needs a poet to give it wings. Decades after the swords fell silent, a young writer named Lucan picked up the story. Living under the rule of Nero, an emperor who embodied the very tyranny Cato had resisted, Lucan saw in the Civil War more than a historical event. He saw the raw material for an epic, a poem he called the Pharsalia, named for that decisive battlefield. In its verses, Lucan performed a kind of alchemy. He did not merely recount Cato's actions, he transfigured him. In Lucan's imagination, Cato ceases to be a flawed, stubborn senator. He becomes virtue incarnate, a walking, speaking ideal. When Lucan's Cato marches his weary troops through the African desert, it is not a military retreat, it is a holy pilgrimage. The poem describes the landscape itself bending to his moral force, with snakes fleeing his path and springs of water bubbling up to meet his virtue. This was no longer biography, it was mythology. Lucan, writing in a time when open political criticism was impossible, used the past as a mirror. By elevating Cato to near divine status, he was making a dangerous, brilliant point. He was arguing that the true stakes of the Civil War were not about which general won, but about which principle survived. In his epic, the real conflict is not between Caesar and Pompey, but between the flexible, brilliant force of ambition and the rigid, unyielding force of virtue. And in that cosmic struggle, Cato's choice in Utica becomes the central, defining event of the entire age, more significant than any battle's outcome. It becomes a declaration that some men are so aligned with what is right that their very presence judges the world. Lucan gave the Roman people, and all who came after, a new way to see Cato. He was no longer just a man who died for a lost cause. He was the cause itself, made flesh, walking through history as a living reproach to tyranny. This poetic portrait ensured that long after the Roman Republic was a distant memory, the symbol of Cato would remain, eternally defiant, a ghost that every subsequent ruler would have to reckon with. Lucan's epic verse gave Cato a mythic stature, but it was the philosophers who would secure his place in the living heart of Stoicism. For the next generation of thinkers, Cato was not a character from a poem. He was the definitive case study, the ultimate proof that their demanding philosophy could actually be lived. No one championed this view more fervently than Seneca the Younger, the wealthy advisor to Emperor Nero. In a strange twist of fate, Seneca lived the life Cato had refused, wielding immense influence within the very imperial court his hero had died opposing. Yet in his many letters and essays, Seneca returns to Cato again and again, holding him up as the flawless model. He calls Cato the perfect wise man, a soul stronger than any fortune. In one powerful passage, Seneca writes, "Cato did not outlive freedom, nor did freedom outlive Cato." Think about the weight of that statement. Seneca is arguing that Cato and the principle of liberty were so perfectly fused that the end of one meant the end of the other. His death was not a defeat but a final, harmonious act of integrity. For Seneca, living in the gilded cage of Nero's court, Cato's example was a daily challenge and a profound comfort. It was a reminder that true freedom was an internal condition, and that even a man surrounded by luxury and danger could cultivate an inner citadel as unassailable as Cato's was in Utica. He used Cato's life to teach a crucial Stoic lesson that our circumstances do not define our character, only our choices do. Meanwhile, the former slave-turned-teacher Epictetus took a more practical, bracing approach. Speaking to his students in simple, powerful language, Epictetus used Cato as the answer to a very common human question: what if things go terribly wrong? What if I lose everything? His response was to point to the man from Utica. Did Cato not live well when he was defeated? Did he not maintain his character when the world fell apart? When he was sick, when he was in danger, when he was dying? For Epictetus, Cato's final days were the ultimate curriculum on how to apply philosophy under the most extreme pressure. He framed Cato's choice not as a political statement, but as a rational calculation anyone could understand, using his famous analogy of the smoky room. If the room, meaning life under tyranny, becomes unbearable to your principles, you are free to leave. Cato simply chose to leave. This stripped the event of its political baggage and presented it as pure philosophy in action, a lesson in maintaining agency until the very last breath. Through these teachers, Cato ceased to be just a historical Roman. He became a universal archetype, the Stoic sage who faced the ultimate test and did not waver. Their frequent, reverent references cemented his story as the central parable of the school. Every time a student of Stoicism wondered if their studies were just theoretical, Seneca and Epictetus would point to Cato and say, "Look, this is what it looks like. This is what it means to be free." Yet to see Cato only as a flawless sage is to miss the full, troubling picture of the man. His very strength contained the seeds of profound criticism, charges that have echoed from his own time to our own. The most persistent accusation is one of rigid fanaticism. His opponents in the Senate did not see a philosopher, they saw an impossible colleague, a man whose unbending principle made the essential work of governance, compromise, functionally impossible. In a system designed for debate and deal-making, Cato often refused to play the game. His filibusters, his walkouts, His absolute refusal to grant any legitimacy to his opponent's proposals could be seen not as protecting virtue, but as paralyzing the state. When the Republic was cracking, his response was not to seek new mortar, but to stand immovably as a single, unyielding stone, even if the whole structure collapsed around him. This raises a painful question. Can a defender be so pure in their defense that they inadvertently become an agent of the destruction they fear? Some historians suggest that his relentless, uncompromising opposition to figures like Caesar, his refusal to ever meet them halfway, may have pushed moderate men toward extremes and made a peaceful political resolution unattainable. His virtue, in this light, was not a saving grace but a catalyst for conflict. Furthermore, his political strategy could be viewed as tragically inept. He understood moral philosophy with crystal clarity, but he seemed to misunderstand human nature and the mechanics of power. He believed that by being conspicuously, impeccably virtuous, others would be shamed into following his example. Instead, he often just alienated them. He prosecuted corruption with such zeal that he made more enemies than allies, fracturing the very senatorial unity needed to counter a threat like Caesar. His austerity, meant to inspire, could come across as a judgmental performance, a daily reminder to his peers of their own moral failings. People do not like to be perpetually judged, and they will rarely follow a leader who makes them feel small. So we are left with a complex duality. The same man who is a symbol of integrity can also be seen as a symbol of political failure. The Stoic who mastered his own soul may have failed to grasp the souls of others. This is not to dismantle his legacy, but to deepen it. A symbol is simple, but a human being is a territory of contradictions. Cato's greatest challenge for us today is not to worship him or to dismiss him, but to sit with this difficult tension. Is unwavering principle the highest good, even if it leads to a worse outcome? Or does true wisdom sometimes require the messy, imperfect work of compromise to preserve a greater whole? His life forces us to ask where the line is between noble defiance and destructive stubbornness, a question that remains urgently alive in any era that values both conviction and cohesion. Centuries later, in the sunlit workshops of Florence and the studious libraries of Venice, a different kind of excavation was underway. Scholars were not digging in the earth, but through long-forgotten manuscripts, recovering the voices of antiquity that had been muted for ages. And among those rediscovered voices, Cato's rang out with a startling, urgent clarity. The Renaissance, a rebirth of classical learning, found in him a perfect mirror for its own ideals. Here was a man who embodied the active civic life, the vita activa, that humanists celebrated, a citizen who placed duty to the Republic above all. For thinkers chafing under the rule of petty princes and corrupt popes, Cato became the ultimate symbol of republican virtue, a figure from the past who seemed to speak directly to their present desires for liberty and moral governance. The newly printed pages of Lucan's Physalia and Plutarch's Lives circulated like intellectual currency, and in them, every artist, writer, and political theorist found a hero ready-made. Niccolò Machiavelli, that shrewd analyst of power, devoted an entire chapter of his discourses on Livy to praising Cato. He argued that a republic fortunate enough to have a man of such unwavering goodness could never be corrupted. For Machiavelli, Cato's value was not just moral but brutally practical. His very existence acted as a check on the ambition of others, a living constitution. This was Cato reimagined not as a martyr, but as a necessary component of a healthy state, his inflexibility now seen as a political asset rather than a flaw. Meanwhile, artists seized upon the drama of his final hours. Painters like Guercino and Salvator Rosa did not depict a bleak suicide, but a noble, almost serene scene of philosophical departure. In their canvases, Cato is often shown bathed in a soft, dignified light, a book open in his lap, his expression one of profound contemplation rather than anguish. The sword is present, but it is not the focus. The focus is the triumph of the illuminated mind over the frailty of the body. These paintings were not morbid. They were lessons in magnanimity, visual sermons on how to die with purpose and thereby define a life. This Renaissance revival transformed Cato once more. He was no longer just a Stoic sage or a Roman relic. He was now a civic saint, a patron of republics and a scourge of tyrants. His story, reborn in the ink of printers and the pigment of painters, provided a powerful vocabulary for resistance. It whispered to merchants in Venetian councils and scholars in Florentine plazas that the love of liberty was an ancient and honorable flame, one that could be rekindled. In resurrecting Cato, the Renaissance was not merely looking backward. It was gathering ancient materials to build a new idea of what a citizen could be. That flame of liberty, rekindled in the Renaissance, would eventually cross an ocean. As the 13 American colonies chafed under the rule of King George III, a familiar ghost from the Roman past found a new home. The architects of the American Revolution were classically educated men, steeped in the histories of Greece and Rome, and among the pantheon of ancient heroes, one figure stood out as the ultimate model of Republican resistance: Cato the Younger. He was not a distant historical curiosity. He was a direct inspiration, a template for action. The revolutionaries saw their own struggle mirrored in his, casting King George as Caesar and themselves as the last defenders of virtue against a corrupt and overreaching empire. This was more than an intellectual parallel. It was a conscious identity they wore with pride. The most direct evidence of this is found in a series of essays that became the intellectual fuel for colonial resistance. Published in the 1720s under the pseudonym Cato, these letters were a sensation. Written by John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, they railed against political corruption and the dangers of standing armies, championing liberty and natural rights. By signing their work Cato, the authors were doing something brilliant. They were borrowing the unimpeachable authority of the Roman martyr. For colonists reading these passionate arguments in newspapers and pamphlets, it wasn't two Englishmen speaking. It was the voice of ancient virtue itself, warning them against tyranny. The Cato letters were arguably the most popular political writings in the colonies before the Revolution, providing a philosophical framework that made resistance to the crown not just permissible, but a moral duty. They turned Cato's story from a lesson in history into a handbook for the present, but the influence went deeper than pamphlets. It shaped the very self-image of the key founders. George Washington, the embodiment of Republican restraint, was often compared to Cato by his contemporaries. He cultivated this image deliberately. Like Cato, he was famous for his austere dignity and his willingness to surrender power, most notably when he resigned his military commission at the end of the war instead of seizing control. This breathtaking act of handing authority back to the civilian government was a direct rebuke to the Caesarean model, a living performance of Cato's ideal that no man should be above the law. John Adams, a man of fierce principle and sometimes stubborn integrity, openly identified with the Roman senator. He wrote passionately about Cato's virtue and saw in his own political battles against what he perceived as monarchical tendencies the same unyielding stand for a republic of laws. And then there was Patrick Henry, whose fiery oration echoed in the same spaces where Cato once filibustered. His legendary cry of "Give me liberty" or "Give me death" is the pure, distilled essence of the Catonian choice, the declaration that some principles are worth the ultimate price. For these men, Cato was not a metaphor, he was a standard. They were not reenacting history, they believed they were continuing it, fighting the same eternal struggle against concentrated power and for the fragile idea of self-government. In framing their conflict this way, they did something profound. They connected their new, experimental nation to the oldest stories of freedom in the Western world. They were planting the seeds of a republic in soil fertilized by ancient virtue, hoping that this time the story might have a different ending. Yet that ancient story of defiance finds a startling echo in our own time. The very philosophy that shaped Cato, once the domain of classical scholars, is now experiencing a remarkable modern revival. Why would a 2,000-year-old school of thought, born in the shadow of Roman porticos, speak so powerfully to people navigating the complexities of the 21st century? The answer lies not in the historical details of Cato's life, but in the timeless psychological framework he embodied. At its core, Stoicism offers a manual for mental resilience in a world that often feels overwhelming and uncontrollable. And Cato stands as its most extreme, most compelling case study. Today's discussions about anxiety, burnout, and the search for personal ethics often circle back to a central Stoic idea, the dichotomy of control. This is the simple, profound notion that some things are within our power and some are not. Our opinions, our judgments, our actions, our character, these are up to us. Everything else, from our reputation and our wealth to the actions of others and the flow of world events, is ultimately not. Cato's entire life was a lived experiment in this principle. He could not control Caesar's ambition, the decay of the Senate, or the outcome of a civil war. These were external events, the chaotic storms of fortune. What he could control with relentless discipline was his own response. His integrity, his adherence to his duty, his final choice, these were his sovereign territory. This is precisely what resonates now. In an age of constant news cycles, social media pressures, and economic uncertainty, the feeling of being buffeted by external forces is pervasive. The Stoic, and Cato as the archetype, offers a different posture. It is not about shutting out the world, but about carefully sorting the world into two categories: what you can influence and what you must learn to accept with grace. His story teaches that our power and our peace begin at the exact point where we stop trying to control the uncontrollable and focus instead on mastering our own judgments and actions. Modern applications of this are everywhere. The executive facing a market downturn focuses not on the panic, but on making clear-headed decisions with the data available. The individual navigating personal loss anchors themselves in their values and the support they can offer to others, rather than railing against the unfairness of fate. This is not passive resignation, it is active, dignified agency applied to the only realm where we truly have it ourselves. Cato's focus on personal ethics in a corrupt system also strikes a deep chord. We may not face a literal Julius Caesar, but many people feel the pressure to compromise their values in professional or social environments, to go along with something that feels wrong for the sake of fitting in or getting ahead. Cato's example, for all its extreme rigidity, asks a haunting question: where is your line? What principle is so fundamental to your character that you would not cross it, even if it meant losing favor, status, or security? He reminds us that integrity is not a grand, single gesture, but the sum of 1,000 small choices to act in accordance with our reasoned principles, especially when it is inconvenient. His life argues that an unshakable character, built day by day, is the ultimate source of resilience. When the external world grows chaotic, that inner fortress, built of consistent choices, becomes our refuge and our strength. We see this in the popularity of Stoic practices like morning reflections on what challenges the day may bring, or evening reviews of our own conduct. These are not mere exercises, they are the daily maintenance of that inner citadel. They are how we cultivate the kind of character that can, like Cato's, remain steady when everything else is in flux. Ultimately, his legacy in our time is not a call to political rebellion or dramatic self-sacrifice. It is an invitation to a quieter, more personal revolution. It is the practice of distinguishing between the noise of the world and the voice of our own reasoned choice, and of finding a profound, unassailable freedom in the commitment to live by that inner compass, no matter the weather outside. But the true power of a symbol lies in its ability to shrink from the epic scale to the human one. While Cato's defiance played out on the grand stage of history, its deepest resonance today is often found in the quiet, personal battles we each face. He has evolved from a political martyr into a universal emblem for the Stoic commitment to live by your own reasoned principles, especially when it is difficult, unpopular, or costly. This is the shift from the Republic to the individual, from the Senate floor to the choices we make in our own homes and workplaces. His story asks a question that transcends any particular era. What does it mean to be morally consistent when no one is watching, and when the only person you have to answer to is the person you see in the mirror? This is where his legacy becomes not just historical, but intensely practical. Think of the countless moments that test our integrity. A colleague suggests fudging a report to make the numbers look better. Social pressure nudges you to laugh at a cruel joke or remain silent in the face of a harmful comment. The temptation arises to take a shortcut that compromises a personal value for a temporary gain. In these instances, the stakes are not the fate of a nation, but the integrity of a single character. Cato's example reframes these moments. They are not minor inconveniences, but the building blocks of an inner citadel. Each time we choose the harder right over the easier wrong, we are, in a small but real way, performing our own Catonian act. We are declaring that our internal compass is more reliable than the shifting winds of external opinion. His defiance becomes a model for individual moral courage precisely because it was so absolute. He did not weigh his principles against convenience or popularity. He saw them as non-negotiable. For us, the lesson is not to adopt his specific political views or his severe lifestyle, but to adopt his clarity of commitment. It challenges us to identify our own non-negotiables, those core values we decide in advance, our lines we will not cross. What is that principle for you? Is it honesty, even when a lie would smooth things over? Is it kindness, even toward someone who has been unkind? Is it fidelity to a personal project or promise, even when initial enthusiasm has faded? Defining that line is the first step. Holding it, especially when it costs us social capital or personal comfort, is the daily practice of Stoic defiance. This is where the philosophy moves from theory to muscle memory. Cato's life reminds us that integrity is not a single grand gesture, but the sum of 1,000 small, consistent choices made in alignment with our deepest understanding of what is right. It is the courage to be the one person in the room who remains seated when everyone else stands for an empty spectacle. It is the resolve to carry your own pack, to be responsible for your own actions, regardless of what others are doing. In a world that often rewards flexibility and compromise, his rigid example serves as a crucial counterweight, a reminder that some bends can eventually break a spirit. By internalizing his symbol, we learn that the most profound form of freedom is not doing whatever we want, but having the strength to do what we believe is right, no matter what we want in the moment. This turns his story from a tale about ancient Rome into a personal toolkit for modern life, offering a timeless standard against which to measure our own quiet acts of courage. So what then makes this defiance ultimate? It is not merely his stubbornness, nor even his final choice alone. Cato achieved something far rarer, a perfect and terrifying alignment between belief and action. His was a defiance that operated on 3 distinct levels, each one reinforcing the other into an unbreakable whole. First, it was the complete fusion of philosophical conviction with decisive action. For many, Stoicism is an intellectual exercise, a set of comforting ideas for difficult times. For Cato, it was an operating manual he followed to its final, logical instruction. He did not just believe that virtue was the only good, he structured his entire public and private life as a continuous proof of it. He did not just theorize about accepting fate, he met the collapse of his world with a calm, reasoned response. The philosophy provided the blueprint, and his life was the meticulous construction. There was no gap between what he professed and what he performed, making his integrity not a pose but a profound consistency. Second, and this is the crucial alchemy, he transformed a total political and military defeat into an undeniable moral victory. Caesar won the war, the legions, and the empire. But Cato, by the manner of his departure, won the argument about what was worth fighting for. He reframed the entire conflict. It was no longer about who held power, but about what kind of character could hold power over itself. In choosing his end, he seized the narrative from the victor. He demonstrated that while Caesar could command the state, he could not command Cato's soul. This inversion is the heart of his ultimate defiance. The loser of the battle became the victor in the story, defining the terms of his own legacy in a way that his conqueror could not erase. Finally, this act created a legacy that did not just outlast his conquerors, it actively outshone them in the realm of moral imagination. Caesar's empire splintered and faded. But Cato's story grew brighter with each retelling, a beacon for republicans, philosophers, and revolutionaries. He became more than a historical figure. He became a symbol, a shorthand for the principle that some lines must never be crossed. His conquerors are studied, but he is invoked. We analyze Caesar's tactics, but we measure our own integrity against Cato's resolve. In the end, his ultimate defiance was this. He proved that the most powerful force in the world is not an army, but a person whose inner convictions are so perfectly aligned that they become an unassailable fortress, a living idea that no sword can ever truly defeat. This contrast reveals why Cato occupies such a singular space within the Stoic tradition. To see his uniqueness, we can place him alongside two other giants of the philosophy, his fellow Roman Seneca and the emperor Marcus Aurelius. Each faced the ultimate test of their principles, yet their circumstances and their choices paint a different portrait of Stoicism in action. Seneca, like Cato, was ordered to take his own life. The Emperor Nero, his former student, demanded it. Seneca complied, meeting his end with the calm dignity his writings preached, but the nature of the pressure was profoundly different. Seneca's death was a reaction to a direct personal command from a tyrant he had served. It was a final, forced act of loyalty or punishment within the closed system of the imperial court. His defiance, if we can call it that, was in the graceful acceptance of an unjust sentence, a private performance of philosophical resolve for his inner circle. Marcus Aurelius presents another, equally powerful model. He wielded ultimate power as emperor, yet he used his meditations to wage a constant, internal war against his own ego, anger, and temptation. His Stoicism was the quiet discipline of the ruler, a daily practice of humility and duty in the face of immense responsibility and the burdens of command. His test was the corruption of absolute power, and his defiance was against the decay of his own character. Now look at Cato. His choice was none of these things. It was not a reaction to an execution order. It was a preemptive, proactive refusal of a political reality he deemed intolerable. It was not a private philosophical exercise, but a devastatingly public political statement aimed at the heart of the state itself. He was not navigating life within an imperial system. He was rejecting the very premise of that system's legitimacy. This is what cements his unique niche. Seneca demonstrated how a Stoic meets a personal fate. Marcus Aurelius showed how a Stoic wields power, but Cato showed how a Stoic defies power. His was a Stoicism of the citizen, the senator, the republican. His final act was not about accepting a personal sentence, but about sentencing an entire political order as incompatible with virtue. Where others responded to imperial pressure, Cato created a pressure of his own, turning his own end into a lasting judgment on tyranny itself. This proactive, public, and politically charged defiance is why his story resonates not just as philosophy, but as a foundational myth for liberty. This leaves us with a profound and difficult question. one that has echoed through Stoic classrooms for 2,000 years. Should Cato's final choice be imitated? Is this the ultimate goal of a Stoic life, to make such a dramatic exit? The answer from the philosophy itself is far more nuanced and far more challenging than a simple yes or no. Stoicism never prescribed suicide as a duty or a default. Think of it not as an instruction, but as a permission, a rational option reserved for the most extreme and specific of conditions. The ancient teachers were very clear about this. They spoke of it only when a person faced circumstances that utterly blocked the path to a virtuous life, such as a debilitating illness with no hope of relief that stripped away all capacity for reasoned action, or, as in Cato's case, a political reality that demanded complicity in what they saw as profound injustice. The key was always rational evaluation, not emotional despair. It was about a clear-eyed assessment that the room, to use Epictetus's analogy, had become so thick with smoke that staying was no longer tenable for a moral being. The act itself was never the point, the rigorous reasoning behind it was. This is where the modern danger of romanticization lies. It is easy to fixate on the sword, the blood, the dramatic finality. But to do so is to miss the entire lesson. We are not meant to admire the method, we are meant to understand the mindset. The power of Cato's story is not that he died, but why he chose to, and the unwavering character that led him to that moment of choice. He spent decades building an inner citadel so strong that when the external world became intolerable to his principles, he had a place of absolute integrity from which to make his final, reasoned decision. The imitation, then, is not of his final act, but of the lifelong construction project. It is the daily, often quiet work of aligning our actions with our reasoned principles, of strengthening our resolve so that we know, with certainty, where our own non-negotiable lines are drawn. The question for us becomes not, would I have the courage to do that, but do I have the clarity to know what I stand for, and the consistency to stand for it every single day in 1,000 smaller ways. That is the true inheritance from Utica, a challenge to live with such deliberate purpose that our final choices, whenever they come, are merely the last note in a symphony of integrity we have been composing all along. The echo of that final choice would reverberate far beyond the pages of history books. Cato's story proved too potent, too visually dramatic to remain confined to text. It leapt from the scrolls of philosophers and into the vibrant world of art, theater, and popular imagination, with each new generation finding in his silhouette a shape that fit their own anxieties and aspirations. In the early 1700s, a single play would ignite this symbolic power with unprecedented force. Joseph Addison's tragedy, Cato, premiered in London in 1713, and it became a cultural phenomenon. On the surface, it was a straightforward retelling of those final days in Utica, filled with noble speeches about liberty and duty, but its audience heard a very contemporary message. In a Britain deeply divided over questions of royal succession and political corruption, Addison's Cato became a vessel for Whig ideals, a critique of absolute monarchy, and a celebration of Republican virtue. The theater was not merely a stage, it was a political arena where the struggles of ancient Rome were performed as commentary on modern London. The play's famous lines, like "What pity is it that we can die but once to serve our country," were quoted everywhere, from coffee-house debates to parliamentary speeches. Its influence even crossed the Atlantic, where the future American founders would memorize its passages. George Washington had it performed for his troops at Valley Forge to bolster their resolve during that desperate winter. Here, Cato was no longer a complex historical figure. He was a polished archetype, a flawless orator for freedom whose every line could be weaponized for contemporary political battles. The stage simplified him, sanding off his stubborn edges and political failures to present a pure, inspiring symbol of resistance against tyranny. This theatrical Cato was less a man and more a magnificent rhetorical statue, one that revolutionaries on both sides of the ocean were eager to claim as their own. While actors declaimed his words on stage, painters sought to capture the profound silence of his final moments. The neoclassical artists of the 18th and 19th centuries were drawn to the scene in his chamber, but they approached it not with gore, but with a sublime, almost sacred calm. Think of the works by masters like Guercino or Benjamin West. They do not show a violent end, but a philosophical transition. In these canvases, Cato is often bathed in a soft, ethereal light, his body posed with the grace of a resting hero. The fatal wound is discreet if shown at all. His gaze is typically turned inward or upward, lost in profound thought, a scroll or a book, Plato's Phaedo, often resting in his hand or by his side. The sword lies nearby, not as a brutal instrument, but as a solemn attribute like the tool of a scholar. These artists were not documenting a death, they were illustrating a triumph of the soul over circumstance. They used the visual language of martyrdom, but a secular, civic martyrdom. The message was clear. Here was a man who conquered the greatest human fear through reason, whose virtue was so luminous it transformed a personal tragedy into a public monument. This artistic interpretation served a dual purpose. It made a difficult Stoic concept, the rational acceptance of one's end, beautiful and aspirational. It also sanitized the act for polite society, focusing on the glory of the principle rather than the physical reality. In the clean lines and ordered compositions of neoclassical art, Cato's Defiance became a lesson in aesthetic nobility, a visual sermon on how to die well, which implicitly taught audiences how to live with principle. This process of reinterpretation never ceased. As political winds shifted, so did the emphasis of Cato's story. For Enlightenment thinkers, he was a champion of individual liberty and rational choice against superstition and despotism. For the Romantic era, with its fascination with doomed heroes and intense emotion, aspects of his story could be seen as a tragic, passionate commitment to a lost cause. In more modern literary treatments, writers have sometimes explored the psychological cost of such rigid virtue, or used him as a foil to examine the pragmatism of figures like Caesar. Each era, in essence, dresses Cato in its own ideological clothing. We see what we need to see in him. When a culture fears centralized power, Cato the Republican martyr stands tall. When it values personal integrity in the face of corporate or social pressure, Cato the Stoic individualist emerges. His symbol is like a prism, turning the white light of his historical actions into a spectrum of meanings, each color visible to a different age. This adaptability is the true testament to the power of his story. A symbol that cannot be reinterpreted is a dead symbol, frozen in one moment. Cato's image has remained alive for millennia precisely because it is flexible enough to be relevant, yet solid enough to always mean something substantial. He provides a timeless language for discussing the eternal tension between personal conviction and external pressure, a conversation that every society must have with itself. The paintings may hang in museums and the specific politics of Addison's play may fade, but the core question Cato embodies remains perpetually modern, waiting for the next artist, writer, or thinker to find in his ancient Defiance a mirror for their own time. We are left then with a man and a monument, a historical figure and a timeless symbol. The real Marcus Porcius Cato was a flesh and blood politician, gifted with fierce intelligence and burdened by profound flaws. He could be self-righteous, politically inflexible, and at times spectacularly inept at building the coalitions necessary to save the very republic he loved. His stubbornness likely hastened the conflict he sought to avoid. This is the complex, contradictory man who walked the streets of Rome. Yet standing beside him is the icon, Cato the Stoic martyr, the unbreakable pillar of virtue. This is the symbol that marched through Lucan's poem, inspired Renaissance painters, and fueled a revolution. So how do we reconcile the flawed man with the flawless ideal? Perhaps we do not need to choose. The true genius of Cato may lie precisely in the conscious performance that bridged the two. He was not a sage who effortlessly embodied perfection. He was a determined student of philosophy who decided, day after day, to act as if he were one. Every barefoot walk, every prosecution of corruption, every silent protest in the theater was a deliberate choice to perform the principles of Stoicism on the public stage. He was crafting a character, building his persona brick by principled brick. His final act in Utica was not a departure from this project, but its masterful completion. In that quiet room, he authored the last scene of his own life's drama, ensuring the character he had so carefully constructed would forever eclipse the man's inevitable shortcomings. In doing so, he achieved something extraordinary. He successfully translated his personal, rigid code into a universal language of defiance. The specific political battles faded, but the image of a person choosing principle over power, integrity over life itself, remained indelible. He became a template. When later generations faced their own tyrannies, their own moral compromises, they did not recall the details of Roman tax policy or senatorial procedure. They recalled the silhouette of a man reading philosophy by lamplight, calmly asserting his final sovereignty. The historical Cato may have lost his republic, but the symbolic Cato won the argument about what is worth defending. He proved that a life lived as a conscious performance of virtue can, in the end, become virtue itself for those who remember it. The man was mortal, but the template he forged is forever. From a stubborn senator to an eternal icon, the journey reveals a profound transformation. Cato did not become a symbol by winning battles or passing laws, but by losing them with such unwavering character that the loss itself became a new kind of victory. His story is the ultimate argument that philosophy is not a retreat from the world, but a toolkit for engaging with it at its most brutal and demanding. It moves from the quiet of the classroom to the roar of the Senate floor, from theoretical debates about the good life to the concrete, final choice in a lamplit room. He proved that Stoicism at its core is not about passive contemplation, but about active, often difficult, alignment. It is the daily practice of making your actions match your deepest convictions, especially when the cost is high and the world urges you to bend. This is where his power truly resides. He turned abstract principles into a lived performance, showing that integrity is not a single grand gesture, but the sum of 1,000 consistent choices, a fortress built brick by brick until it becomes unassailable. His legacy, therefore, is not a prescription for how to die, but a challenge for how to live. It asks each of us a simple, formidable question. What are your unshakable principles? Where is the line you have decided in advance you will not cross, regardless of pressure, popularity, or personal cost? Cato's life insists that we define that line for ourselves, not in a moment of crisis, but in the quiet clarity of reflection, so that when the storm comes, we know what we stand for. His symbol stands across the centuries not to be worshipped, but to be consulted, a mirror held up to our own capacity for courage and consistency. If this exploration of one man's defiant stand has sparked your curiosity about the philosophy that shaped him, our channel offers many more guides. You can delve deeper into the practical wisdom of Stoicism, exploring the teachings of Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, to discover how these ancient ideas can forge resilience and purpose in your own modern life. The journey from principle to action begins with a single step of understanding.